Today we are going to talk about glazing. The first thing we do when we glaze is we go over to the bisqueware shelf, we find our piece, we collect it, we bring it to our shelf. When you're ready to do your glazing, you're going to take it down and make sure it's not dusty or dirty. Make sure your hands are clean, free of oil. You don't want oils to transfer into your piece and then cause places where the glaze won't stick. So I've got a piece. I want to dip this in glaze. That means I need to put wax on the bottom of my piece so that the glaze does not stick there. We can use wax in other ways, which we can talk about in just a little bit, but primarily we use it for the bottoms of pieces. So I'm going to wet my brush, and before I put any wax on it, I'm going to use this bar of soap that's over by the wax on the shelf, and I'm going to rub it all over the brush head so that I have soap on my brush before I put wax on it. This creates a barrier between your brush and the wax and makes it less likely for the wax to ruin the brush. There are lots of little wax cups that are over there as well. So if there's multiple people doing this, then you can just pour some in a little cup. So I want to make sure I don't get this on the other part of any other part of my piece than the bottom. And I don't need multiple coats of wax. One coat is plenty. It sucks into the clay, and that's all you need. So I've got it on the very bottom, and I also want to bring the wax up about 1/4 of an inch. It kind of depends on the glaze you're using, but to be safe, we'll say 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to do that around the entire foot. So I've got wax now on the entire foot here, and I need to let this dry. This needs to be dry to the touch, not sticky at all. I'm going to leave it turned upside down, and I'm going to go wash this brush out with soap and water immediately. While we let this dry, we'll talk about some other things. So, letting wax dry, there are other ways you can use wax. So you could use wax to draw designs onto bare clay, and then the glaze will resist in that area, and you can have a design. You have to make sure whenever you're using wax that you get all the glaze off of that wax, every little piece, because it falls off of the piece if you don't, and it deposits on the shelves, which is not what we want. So if you're going to use wax, either just on the bottom of something or as a design, you have to make sure you get all that glaze off of there. Other things you can do before you glaze are using underglazes. So we've talked about underglazes just by the shelf, how you can use them. You'll also see in the video on green surfacing how you can use underglazes there. Underglazes are pretty simple. They're a commercial product. They're a lot more like paints. And shake these up, make sure they're a good consistency. And you can get a little dish to put this in, or depending on what you're doing, if you don't need a lot of it, you can just use it right out of the container. Make sure you check. So this hasn't been open for a while, so it's got some thick stuff at the top of it. So I'm going to use the back of a paintbrush and kind of push that down. If the consistency is a little thick, you could put it into a little container and put a little bit of water with it. You don't want it to be like super thick. but if it's really watery, it takes a lot of coats to cover, so just kind of gauge what you need. So underglaze, make sure my piece was wiped off before I did this, and I can draw a design on there, paint shapes, kind of use them like you would paints, and just make sure you refer to the test tiles so you know what it's going to look like when you're done. And again, generally about two coats of this is what you're going for to get it to hold up to the clear glaze. So if it's very thin and you put a clear glaze over it, it kind of eats the color. If you weren't going to put a glaze over it, you can do it as thin as you want. Lots of people use these sort of like watercolors without glaze on top. So that's an option too. But if you're going to put a glaze on it, it needs to be about 2 coats thick. I just drew a little design on there. And I could let this just dry the touch. I could use other colors. You just don't want to build up too much of a thickness because it tends to get a little bit bubbly and crusty looking when you do that. Other things you can do before you glaze are you can use a wash. So again, this works really well for things that you're not planning on glazing. You can use this stain wash, and you can use it on pieces that have nice texture or carving that you want to accentuate. So I like wearing gloves. You don't have to. There's gloves in the cabinet. I just don't like getting it all over my hands. So this is the stain wash, and I'm gonna mix it up just by swirling it around first, and then open it, and I'm gonna mix it again, making sure it settles out really hard, and we want to make sure all that is incorporated. So once I feel like it's incorporated, I'm going to always swirl it around before I use it. And I'm going to apply this colorant to the area that has this nice texture to it and carving. I could go all the way around on this. We'll see what it looks like when I wipe it back to see if I should go all the way around. So I just really, nothing fancy, just putting that on. And then we're going to take a wet sponge and we're going to start to wipe it back. If I push really hard, I can take away more of it, or if I clean the sponge and do it again, or I can also apply it back with the sponge that has the stain on it. So you can kind of get an accentuation of textures here, and depending on how wide your textures are, it might wipe out more easily than others. So you kind of like don't press as hard so that it stays in there a little bit better. So you can use, stains are really good for pieces that you aren't planning on glazing, and you can get a lot of depth of texture with stains. You certainly can use them under glazes. You have to wipe them back when they go under glazes, because you're basically making a layer of dust between the glaze and the piece. So we have to wipe it back so it's just the stained color. It'll get kind of eaten by the glaze. It depends on which one you're using and what combination. It's not going to be super like extreme though, probably. It'll kind of move into the glaze and become a part of that. I'll talk to you about things you can do after a coat of glaze that involve stains that they show up a lot better. So again, we'll put this aside to be dealt with later. And we're gonna put away our wash and clean our brush. So those are some things we do before we glaze. We make sure our pieces are free of dust. We wax the bottoms. We use a stain if we want to and wipe it back. We can use an underglaze if we want to, and we do not wipe that and just get dipped in clear glaze or a glaze that would show it. And then we let our wax dry, and then we can start glazing.